Hey everyone, Nigel here. As you can probably tell from the title of today's upload, this isn't our usual Crimes of the Week video. We've been pretty much putting all of our attention into getting everything ready for tomorrow's big face reveal and Q&A, so unfortunately we didn't have time to do our usual dive into the news. That being said, we didn't want to leave you all with nothing, so we decided to try something we've never done before. We're calling it a Minisode. Basically, it's a case that's longer than a normal Crimes of the Week segment, but shorter than our usual long-form cases. Honestly, we've got a lot of these little stories that we've collected over the years that we haven't known what to do with up until now. So yeah, we definitely appreciate some feedback on this format. If it's something you all enjoy, we can definitely do some more in the future. Anyway, we know our schedule has been all over the place lately, but we promise that things will go back to normal after tomorrow's Q&A video. Or at least, to a new normal anyway. Thanks so much for all of your support and patience while we've been trying to get everything ready. We're both nervous and excited to finally share everything with you tomorrow. Just a reminder, that video will drop at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Alright, with that out of the way, we hope you enjoy our first ever Crime Zone Minisode. Just after 8 o'clock on the evening of August 2nd, 2010, a security guard in Pickering, Ontario was making his usual rounds when he spotted something strange. The man was part of a team tasked with patrolling a large section of government-owned property called the airport lands. As the name suggests, the land had once been set aside for the construction of a new airport. However, protests and other political wrangling had stalled the project for decades, effectively killing it. Since then, the rural land, which was dotted with decrepit farms and houses, had mostly sat vacant. As is the case with many places that sit unoccupied for so long, the area had eventually attracted its fair share of unwanted nighttime activity. Most of this had been the usual stuff you'd expect. Vandalism, teenagers growing pot, that kind of stuff. However, security had been hired after a string of arsons at several of the abandoned properties, which was understandably taken more seriously by authorities. Still, it was mostly a losing battle since there were thousands of acres to patrol and only ever a handful of security guards on duty at most. On this particular night, though, while driving near Concession 7 Road and Sideline 32, the security guard spotted something that he had never seen before. It was a gray Mercedes that had been left parked on the side of the road. There was no one inside, and the only other landmark within reasonable walking distance was a dilapidated farmhouse, which, like most of the residences around there, had long since been abandoned. Since a luxury vehicle was a fairly uncommon sight in this area, the security guard decided to wait around a bit to see if the owner would return. 2 hours went by, however, he didn't see anyone, and eventually he was forced to continue on with his rounds. By the time he came back to the location later in his shift at about 3:30 a.m., the car was gone. There were no signs of any criminal activity, so the security guard quickly put the situation out of his mind. Fast forward to more than a year later in November of 2011, when a team of contractors were sent out to the airport lands. Several of the abandoned properties in the area had been scheduled for demolition, and as part of the preparations, these crews were now being sent out to conduct inspections to make sure that everything was in order. One of these properties was an old farmhouse on Concession 7 Road, close to the intersection with Sideline 32. It was set back a distance from the road, and the land was only accessible by foot since its driveway had long since been barricaded with concrete blocks. After approaching the residence, the workers realized that the only way in was through the door of a wooden structure attached to the main house. At one point, it might have served as a garage or a barn, but now it was the only part of the building that hadn't been either boarded up completely or overtaken by trees, bushes, and thick patches of long grass. Immediately upon entering, though, the workers were surprised to find that the place showed signs of activity. In the middle of the garage/barn was what looked like someone's workbench, and the thing had clearly been recently painted. Walking through a little farther, the workers encountered a door, behind which was a cement staircase that led to a basement underneath the main house. At the bottom of the stairs was a second door, which they opened only to be greeted by yet another door. This final door was not like the others, though. It had been custom made out of multiple sheets of plywood and was at least 3 inches thick, It had locks made of tire irons. Chillingly, ones that had clearly been designed so that this door could only be unlocked and opened from the outside. After seeing what was behind this last door, the workers immediately called 911. When officers from the Durham police responded to the scene, they were likewise disturbed by what they found in the basement room of the abandoned farmhouse. The whole place was painted white, aside from the floor, which was tiled, and a roughly constructed bench was the only furniture inside. The work on the room had obviously not been done that long ago, owing to a paint tray that had been left in the corner which still smelled strongly, and 2 cartons of soy milk with recent expiry dates. The final 2 features of the room were far and away the most terrifying, though. These were lengths of chain that had been bolted to the ceiling and which extended to the floor, as well as several jugs of water, enough to keep a person alive for several weeks at least. There was no other way around it. Someone had clearly constructed this room for the purposes of confining another human being. The only saving grace appeared to be that the room had been found before it could be used by its creator. After coming to terms with this horrifying realization, Durham police began to scour the place for clues. Aside from the empty soy cartons, there wasn't much to go on, except for some tools with distinctive red paint blots on them, as well as a men's volunteer shirt from a Toronto World Youth Day event from several years ago. When news of the grim discovery was released to the public, people were understandably terrified. The property became known as the Pickering Dungeon House, and widespread speculation began about the sinister intentions of the person or people who had built the secret room. Appeals were released by police, hoping that new information could be found. 2 months later, the situation got even more spooky when it was announced that the dungeon house had burned down under suspicious circumstances. Was it just the latest property to be targeted by random vandals, people wondered? Or was this someone trying to cover their tracks? Finally, police caught a lucky break in February of 2012, when the connection was made between the Pickering Dungeon House and the security guard who had spotted the out-of-place Mercedes in the area 2 summers earlier. Fortunately, the security guard had jotted down the vehicle's license plate information. When authorities looked it up, it led them to a 45-year-old man named Robert Edwin White. At first, Robert seemed like the last person police expected to be constructing a dungeon in an old farmhouse. The 45-year-old was a devoutly religious married father of 2 children, one who ran a successful business and had no prior criminal record. However, as authorities began to scratch below the surface, they discovered some things that were concerning. For starters, the business Robert was involved in was contracting, so he definitely had the skills to construct the room. He was also known to drink soy milk and had a habit of marking his tools with similar red paint blots to the ones police had found at the scene. Investigators also learned that though Robert was currently married, he had been through a nasty divorce with his ex-wife Patricia back in the spring of 2008. The divorce had ended with Robert losing custody of both of his children, after Patricia had accused him of being abusive during their relationship. When police asked Patricia about the evidence they had found in the Pickering Dungeon House, her blood ran cold. She was able to confirm all of the details that they had found related to her ex-husband at the property, including the World Youth Day volunteer shirt, which she said Robert had gotten in 2002. While this evidence was enough to arrest Robert and charge him with attempted kidnapping as well as breaking and entering, the full story behind what had happened and why wouldn't come out until the case went to court several months later. Contrary to what police initially believed, Robert had not made the room to confine Patricia, but in fact had instead constructed it for her best friend Gwen. It turned out that Robert had been harboring a grudge against Gwen for years and believed that she was the cause of all of his problems. In court testimony, Robert revealed that he blamed Gwen not only for the failure of his marriage with Patricia, but also for the fact that he had lost his kids. In the aftermath of the divorce, Gwen and her husband had welcomed Patricia and the kids into their home since they had been close family friends forever. Robert, however, viewed this as an attempt by Gwen to steal his children. He felt that his suspicions were confirmed when, during the divorce, Gwen and her husband had been appointed to temporarily supervise his visits with his children. For the next 18 months, Robert had devoted his spare time to constructing the dungeon in the Pickering farmhouse after discovering the property on a drive one day. Though he claimed in court that he had never planned to actually confine anyone in the room he had built, authorities did not buy this. By this point, a couple of family friends had also come forward, claiming that Robert had mentioned wanting to get back at Gwen numerous times since his divorce, and at one point had even said something about trying to extort a ransom from her husband, though afterwards attempted to play this off like a joke. As a result, authorities argued that the only thing that had stopped Robert from going through with his terrifying plot was the fact that the room had been discovered before he was fully finished the construction. Robert ultimately agreed to plead guilty to a charge of breaking and entering with the intent to commit an indictable offense after prosecutors withdrew the attempted kidnapping charge. As a result, he was sentenced to just 2 years in prison. At his sentencing hearing, Robert appeared to express a great deal of remorse for what had happened, saying that he realized his actions had irreparably damaged his family. However, he still seemed to blame his ex-wife and Gwen for what had happened, saying that his family issues had pushed him to the brink. Patricia and Gwen, meanwhile, said that they would never be able to fully come to terms with what had happened. Patricia stated that she and her children were all now in therapy following the revelations, while Gwen said she would never be able to get the images of the makeshift dungeon out of her head. I, for one, can't blame her. Imagine finding out that someone had spent the last year and a half building a homemade jail cell just for you, where they planned to take you and do God knows what else once you were there. And then the only reason the plan was discovered was because of a massive coincidence. It's truly one of the most disturbing things I've ever heard. As a side note, Robert's new wife also divorced him after learning what he had done for obvious reasons, and though police were suspicious about the arson, it appears that that part of the case was never solved. Given that all of this happened more than a decade ago, it's safe to say that Robert has long since been released from prison. Well, that's it for today's story. Before we wrap up, though, we'd really appreciate it if you'd let us know what you thought of today's upload in the comments section below. Are these mini cases something that you'd like to see more of? If so, what are some shorter stories you'd like to see covered? Also, one last reminder that our Q&A video drops tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We can't wait to see you there. As always, thank you for watching.